You were just my starter home, she whispered, thinking I'd crumble. But she didn't know the safe option had clause. What I did next? It rewrote every rule of betrayal and left her begging at the doorstep she once owned. Let's begin. The soft buzz of the shower masked the silence that filled the kitchen. A stray breeze moved the window curtains, but James Whitaker's eyes were locked on the laptop screen Clara had left open, an unusual lapse in her otherwise calculated routine. His wife had always been meticulous, almost religiously private. But this morning, something was off. A minimized chat box blinked innocently in the bottom corner. He hovered the mouse over it, hesitating. For 6 years, he had been the supportive husband, the dependable one, the safe choice. But in the last few months, Clara had changed. She had become distant, polished on the surface, yet emotionally hollow, like a porcelain doll. He clicked. A message popped up, then another, then a long scroll of conversations with someone named Julian. James's breath caught as he read. "You're my muse," Julian had written. "You're my soul," Clara had replied. And then came the line that shattered everything. "I only married James because he was the safe option, a good starter home. You, Julian, you're the beachfront mansion." For a moment, everything inside James froze. The thrum of the refrigerator suddenly grew unbearable. He felt the cold tiles under his bare feet, grounding him. Safe, predictable, boring. That's what she thought of him. Clara's laugh from the bathroom echoed faintly. She had no idea her world was cracking beneath her. But James? James was already transforming, quietly, dangerously. No confrontation, no screaming, no tears. He wasn't going to give her the drama she could weaponize. Instead, he got to work. He filed for 4 weeks off from his remote systems architect job under family emergency. It was approved instantly. He drained the joint savings, leaving behind the legal daily limit. He would grab the rest after one final bank call tomorrow morning. Packing only essentials, his work laptop, a few clothes, and his grandfather's watch, he paused by her laptop one last time and scribbled a post-it note. "Thanks for calling me your starter home. Consider this my down payment back. You can keep the beachfront mansion." Then, without a sound, he walked out. 6 hours later, James pulled into a coastal town he vaguely remembered from childhood, checked into a motel using cash, and turned off his phone. For the first time in years, the safe option had vanished, and the storm behind him was just beginning. The motel room smelled of bleach and ocean air, two scents James would never have associated together. Yet now, they were the backdrop to his new reality. He had rented the room under a false name, paid for 2 weeks in cash, and set up his workstation on a small table by the window. The Wi-Fi was surprisingly strong. The view, less so, a gas station and a distant strip of sand. But he wasn't here for the view. He wasn't hiding. He was planning. Each day, he logged into his job remotely for a few hours. He answered emails, smiled in Zoom meetings, made it look like he was on a quiet working vacation. No one suspected anything. Not his boss, not his team, not even Clara. Not yet. He bought a burner phone, but didn't use it for 2 days. When he finally called his best friend, Mark Denton, it was with a steady voice. Mark, loyal and blunt, answered with, "Jesus, man, you okay?" Claire's been blowing up everyone's phone. "She knows I'm gone." James asked. "She's in full Oscar-winning mode," Mark muttered. "Calling your parents, saying you're having some kind of breakdown. My girlfriend ran into her, said Clara looked like a widow at a funeral." James said nothing. It was all unfolding, just as he predicted. The moment Clara realized she wasn't in control of the narrative, she weaponized his silence. He knew it would happen. Knew she'd cast him as unstable to cover her own betrayal. But that was fine. She had made her bed, and now she could lie in it, alone. By the 3rd day, the account was fully drained. The rest of the joint savings, their house deposit, their vacation fund, the financial cushion they'd built, was now in James's sole possession. It wasn't revenge. Not yet. It was insurance. Clara called the bank. Screamed. Threatened. The mutual friend at the bank told Mark it took 3 employees to calm her down. But legally, the account had both their names. James had every right. Then came the email to their landlord. The lease was still active. Breaking it would cost a chunk, unless Clara could afford the place on her own. Spoiler, she couldn't. Mark, being Mark, couldn't resist digging deeper. With a few clever searches and some light social media stalking, he found out that Julian, the beachfront mansion, was more like a flooded basement. The guy lived in a rented loft with 5 roommates, called himself an artist, but mostly bartended at a mid-tier lounge downtown. His Instagram was full of half-finished paintings, moody quotes, and shirtless mirror selfies. He was all illusion, no substance. Clara had traded loyalty for fantasy. She had mistaken polish for power. And now, she was falling hard. But what gnawed at James the most wasn't Clara's betrayal. It was how easily the world had believed her. His own sister called Mark crying, asking if James needed intervention. His mother left voicemails full of soft guilt. She made a mistake, but you've left her with nothing, James. That's not who you are. And maybe it wasn't. But he didn't recognize who he was anymore, either. The safe option was gone. What remained was someone sharper, colder, and just getting started. After 3 weeks in the coastal town, between early morning walks on the beach and late nights staring at the ceiling, James finally returned to the city. He didn't go home. He went to Mark's spare bedroom, still off-grid to everyone else except one person. Clara didn't know he was back, and that was the way he wanted it. He turned on his old phone for the first time since disappearing. The screen erupted with missed calls, voicemails, and desperate text messages. Clara's name was everywhere. Mixed among them were messages from his mom, his sister, even old college friends. One particular voicemail from Clara stood out. Her voice was hoarse, almost manic. "Please just come home, James. We can talk. I never meant to." He didn't bother listening to the rest. Instead, he sent her a single message. "Tomorrow, noon, apartment. We talk about the lease." No emotion, no closure, just logistics. The next day, he arrived early. The apartment felt different. Her shoes by the door, her candles on the shelf, her untouched wine glasses. It was like stepping into a stage set. Lifeless, artificial. Every corner whispered the story of who they used to be, but now it all felt curated. Cold. He sat on a couch they had once picked out after a 2-week debate. He remembered how she wanted cream, he wanted gray. They'd compromised, teal. Now the teal mocked him. When Clara walked in, it was as if she had stepped out of a movie. Hair done, makeup flawless. She wore soft colors and sad eyes, the perfect tragic wife. Her mascara shimmered like guilt, but her body language said performance. "You look," she hesitated. "Okay." "I am," he said plainly. That threw her. She needed him to be broken. Needed him to be the bitter, wounded man whose rage validated her affair. But James's stillness unsettled her more than anger ever could. She launched into her speech, a carefully rehearsed monologue full of vague regret. How she had been lost. How Julian manipulated her emotions. How she made a mistake. But never once did she say, "I cheated." When she finally stopped, James nodded and said, "So that's the story you're telling people." Her lips parted slightly, confused. "I'm pouring my heart out to you." "No," James interrupted. "You're performing. I read the chat logs, Clara. Every word." That made her flinch. A true reaction, the first since she entered the room. "You weren't supposed to see that," she whispered. "I wasn't supposed to wake up, you mean?" The safe option was never meant to look under the hood. Tears began to fall, not the graceful kind, but the messy, uncontrolled sobs that blurred eyeliner and cracked voices. "What am I supposed to do now?" she sobbed. "You took everything. I have nothing left." James tilted his head. "You have Julian." Her face twisted. "He's not who I thought. He's broke, James. He's not complicated," he said, cutting her off. "He's broke. He's a fraud. He's the dream you thought you deserved." Then he stood. "I'm filing for divorce today. Adultery. Citing evidence. I have it all backed up. I'll pay the break penalty on the lease. That gives you until the end of next month to find somewhere else to live." She stared at him in disbelief. "You can't do this. That money, the savings, that was ours." "No," James said calmly, opening the door. "It was mostly mine. You remember the prenup you never bothered reading? The one you signed just to get it over with?" Color drained from her face. "It has an infidelity clause. In case of cheating, assets divide by contribution. You brought in 10%. I have all the pay stubs. My lawyer will be in touch." Clara's calm shattered. "You're a bastard." James paused in the doorway. "No," he whispered. "I was a starter home. Now I'm just empty." And with that, He left, leaving her screaming behind him in a hollow echo of the life she had destroyed. The divorce wasn't swift. It wasn't clean. It was a battle of attrition, emotional, legal, financial. And it started the moment Clara received the notice from James's attorney. She did what he knew she would. She hired a predator in a tailored suit, a divorce attorney who specialized in image manipulation. Her team tried painting James as emotionally abusive, cold, distant, an unfeeling technocrat, they called him. They cherry-picked emails, dug up therapy notes from years prior, and worst of all, they dragged his silence into court like it was a crime. She disappeared without a word, her lawyer argued. Who does that unless they have something to hide? James sat there, still as stone, his lawyer beside him flipping through the hundreds of chat logs. The time-stamped, dated, damning truth. But the emotional cost, that hit him when his sister, Elena, took the stand for Clara. James had always believed she would have his back. They shared birthdays 2 years apart, late-night childhood whispers, and a fierce sibling bond. But there she was, eyes glossy, saying, "I truly believe my brother was spiraling. Clara told us he was emotionally unstable." I didn't know what to believe anymore. He never looked at her again after that. His mother, now painfully neutral, sat outside the courtroom most days. The woman who once adored Clara now looked as if grief aged her overnight. She apologized in hushed phone calls. James didn't reject her, but the scar was forming, not just from betrayal, but from the silence of the people who should have known better. In court, Clara cried when it counted. Her voice shook when it mattered, but none of it could compete with the truth. A hard drive full of explicit messages. Financial records proving James funded 90% of their shared life. Screenshots of Julian's empty promises and Clara's cold analysis of her marriage. One message even likened James to a walking wallet with Wi-Fi. In the end, the judge didn't slam the gavel or deliver any dramatic verdict. It was a quiet ruling, in a room that smelled of paper and stale coffee. Prenup upheld. Divorce granted. Assets divided by financial contribution. James kept the bulk of the savings. But it didn't feel like victory. Afterward, Clara was forced to move back in with her parents. Julian vanished the moment her bank account ran dry. Mark sent James a screenshot from Julian's Instagram, a new muse already in his feed. Same captions. Different woman. Clara unraveled quickly. She missed work, then stopped going altogether. Her marketing agency quietly let her go. Her LinkedIn disappeared. Word spread, and suddenly, the woman who once curated her life like a Pinterest board became a whisper in wine circles. James sat in his new apartment, smaller, quieter, with secondhand furniture and white walls. The silence now was different. It wasn't hollow. It was clean. But even in victory, grief lingered. Not for Clara, but for the 6 years he gave to someone who never really saw him. That was the deepest betrayal of all. James hadn't cried during the divorce. Not in court. Not after the verdict. Not even when he boxed up the last remnants of a life he used to believe in. But now, in the stillness of his new apartment, a one-bedroom unit tucked behind a used bookstore, the weight of everything began to settle. There were no dramatic meltdowns, no outbursts, just small aches that clung to everyday rituals. He would make coffee and realize he no longer had to leave the extra spoon for Clara's sugar. He would pass by the couch. Not the teal one. He sold that. But a generic, charcoal gray one from a clearance sale, and feel the ghost of an argument they once had over fabric patterns. Therapy helped. Slowly. His therapist, Dr. Callum, a calm woman with no illusions and too many degrees, asked him once, "Why do you think you accepted being the safe option for so long?" James had stared at the rug for a long time. "Because I wanted to be needed," he finally said. "Because I thought love looked like compromise, like proving yourself. But love without respect becomes servitude," she said. "You weren't in a marriage. You were in a transaction." And that hit harder than the betrayal itself. He began writing again, something he hadn't done since college. It wasn't poetry or fiction, but long journal entries that sometimes turned into letters he never sent. One day, he wrote a piece titled Starter Homes and Other Lies. He never shared it with anyone. But in those pages, he described the pain of invisibility, of watching someone choose a fantasy over your loyalty. He started jogging, not out of fitness obsession, but because the rhythm of his breath and feet grounded him when the silence got too loud. He ran early, before the sun came up, because the city wasn't awake yet and didn't look at him with knowing eyes. Mark visited often, usually with pizza, sometimes with whiskey. You know, Mark said one night, when she called you to start her home, that was her projecting. She was the one afraid of being real. James didn't respond. He didn't need to. But not all relationships healed. Elena never reached out again, even after the court ruling, even after the documents proved everything. She sent one message that simply said, "I still think you handled it wrong." He didn't reply. His mother, on the other hand, was slowly mending fences. She had cried after the trial. Real tears, not performative ones. She said, "I should have known. I should have believed you. I'm sorry." And James, in that moment, let go of a fraction of the pain. One morning, he received an email. The sender was a former colleague of Clara's, someone named Alana, who he barely remembered. "I heard what happened. I know we never really talked much, but I wanted to say you didn't just leave. You survived. And sometimes surviving looks like disappearing." That single line stayed with him for days. Not all pain leaves you shattered. Some simply reshapes you. James wasn't looking to rebuild what he lost. He was learning how to build something new, something that no one else could quietly take away. It wasn't enough to move on. Not yet. Something inside James still burned. Not hatred. No, hatred gives too much power. This was something more strategic, sharper. It was the realization that Clara had always calculated him, measured him like a budget, an equation. She never truly knew who he was. She never cared to. He remembered the early days, vividly. Their first real date. A rooftop bar, her laughter echoing against city noise, her fingers brushing against his wrist like a soft secret. At the time, he thought that moment meant something. But now, in hindsight, he saw how much of it was rehearsed. Clara had always been a performer. She didn't fall in love. She cast people in roles. And James? He was the stable engineer with a quiet future and solid benefits. The perfect starter husband. But Clara hadn't accounted for depth, for memory, for the man beneath the modest clothes and scheduled habits. And James hadn't forgotten the betrayal. He began gathering everything, every receipt, every message, every work bonus that contributed to their lifestyle, every instance where Clara claimed credit for something she never built. He compiled a digital archive so detailed and ironclad that it could have been a thesis. But this wasn't for the court anymore. It was for her legacy. While Clara stumbled into obscurity, ghosting job interviews, burning bridges, getting politely shunned by the same social circles that once praised her brunch photos and curated charm, James waited. But he didn't sit idle. He began anonymously sending her job applications to roles he knew she'd never qualify for. Senior positions, executive titles, always referencing skills she didn't have, and always from recruiters he knew. Subtle seeds of embarrassment planted inside companies that once admired her. Then came Julian. James knew Julian wasn't worth any real focus. But Clara had once described him as the mansion, the ultimate prize. So James made a few calls. Mark had a friend in real estate photography who moonlighted as a wedding videographer. Through a long chain of favors, James acquired Julian's real address. Not the dreamy art loft Clara imagined, but a rundown apartment with a duct-taped window. James mailed a copy of the chat logs there. Printed. Bound. No note. No name. Just the truth, hand-delivered to the doorstep of a man who thought himself a muse-worthy genius. The goal wasn't confrontation. It was corrosion. Clara had built her ego on illusions. Now James was feeding termites into every wooden beam of that fragile empire. And slowly, it began to collapse. Her name vanished from professional networks. Her social media shifted from selfies and quotes to silence. Her mutual friends, the ones who had once raised glasses at their wedding, started texting him, not her. One message read, "Did Clara really say you were a starter home? That's brutal. Honestly, man, you deserve better." Revenge didn't come with fireworks. It came with hollow spaces and whispering ghosts. And Clara now lived in both. But James wasn't finished. He had one more card to play, and he intended to play it slowly. James had never thought of himself as a vengeful man. But Clara's betrayal wasn't just infidelity. It was strategic. A long con masked in candlelit dinners and careful smiles. She'd weaponized his stability, used his love as a ladder, and then mocked the ground he gave her to stand on. So now, he designed revenge the same way he designed a system at work. Carefully, thoroughly, with no room for error. It started with reputation. He knew Clara had applied for work at a boutique marketing firm downtown, Archer & Knox. James had helped one of their founders build their cloud infrastructure 3 years earlier. They liked him, trusted him. So, when he reached out under a pseudonym, posing as a reference checker, he dropped one quiet comment. You might want to confirm her previous salary claims. They seemed inflated. He never had to say more. Later that week, a mutual friend told Mark that Clara didn't make it to the second interview. Some red flags came up, the friend whispered. That was the opening. Next came something more personal. James drafted a message. Not bitter, not accusing. Just honest. He sent it to 3 people Clara had leaned on during their relationship. Her best friend, her cousin, and her old college roommate. All 3 had once whispered doubts to James about Clara's coldness. He remembered. I'm not asking for sympathy. I just want to clarify something. She didn't leave me. I left after discovering a year-long affair. I never confronted her. I simply walked away. I still have the messages. I just didn't want to make a scene. He attached a screenshot. Just one. A message where Clara wrote, he's the safe option. I married him because he was stable. He's not passion. He's utility. He never heard back from 2 of them. But the college roommate replied the next morning. I knew something felt off. I'm sorry. I believe her version of you. I won't anymore. It wasn't justice. But it was reality, returned to its rightful shape. James didn't want Clara ruined. Not exactly. He wanted the world to see the version of her that he had seen behind closed doors. Not the glamorous, intelligent marketer who hosted brunches and read self-help books, but the cold strategist who calculated people like balance sheets. Meanwhile, he poured himself into therapy and work. Every victory was internal, every scar examined. He realized that for years, he had mistaken peace for settling. He'd shrunk himself to keep a broken marriage upright. No more. One night, he met Mark and his girlfriend at a restaurant. They toasted to freedom. And halfway through dinner, Mark's girlfriend asked, would you ever date again? James gave a half smile. Eventually, but not as the safe option. That night, he walked home alone, wind in his face, coat open. And for the first time since this all began, he didn't feel haunted. He felt grounded. But there was still one thing left to do. One final chapter. And it would be written with more than coldness. It would be written with clarity. The idea came to James as he stood in line at a bookstore, watching a woman buy a copy of a memoir titled Burn Beautiful, Surviving Emotional Abuse and Rising from the Ashes. The irony hit him like a brick. Clara would have loved that book. She would have highlighted the poetic lines, posted them on her story, and sipped wine while reading passages aloud to her friends, all while pretending she was the victim of some unspeakable emotional burden, a misunderstood woman chained to a man who didn't get her. That's when James knew. His revenge wasn't about destruction. It was about exposure. Let her rebuild, let her pretend, but not without the world knowing who she really was. He didn't want to shout. He didn't want to destroy her reputation in some messy way that made him look bitter. He wanted the truth to surface, naturally, like oil rising in water. So he organized a dinner. It was a closure gathering, or at least that's how he described it in the messages. He invited 4 people. Not many, just the right ones. Clara's former boss at the agency where she'd once bragged about her leadership skills. Her cousin Daniela, the only family member she actually respected. His mother, who'd been grappling with guilt ever since court. And Mark, of course, who had been his anchor through the storm. He held it at a quiet Italian restaurant with dim lighting and a private room. He reserved the long oak table in the back and paid for everything up front. Clara arrived 15 minutes late, of course. Dressed beautifully. Too beautifully. A designer coat. Perfect lipstick. She looked like the heroine of a sad indie film. The audience was set. She scanned the room, confused. What is this? She asked. James gestured politely. Dinner. For closure. I figured if we're going to start new chapters, we should end this one properly. Her eyes narrowed, but she sat. Daniela offered a hesitant smile. Mark simply nodded. Clara's old boss, Leland, sipped his wine like this was theater. His mother said nothing. Small talk floated through the first half hour. Clara tried to charm the room, laughing at old stories, reminiscing, pretending to play the part of the slightly tragic but ultimately noble ex-wife. James watched it all with clinical precision. Then, over dessert, he said, "Clara, I wanted to ask something, just to clear the air." She blinked. "Sure. You told people I abandoned you, that I had a breakdown, that I was emotionally cold." A flicker of panic passed across her face. "James, I think we agreed not to." "No," he said calmly, placing a small velvet pouch on the table and sliding it to the center. "What you didn't tell them was that I read every single message between you and Julian. I downloaded the chat logs before I left. All 312 of them. Dated. Saved. Cataloged." The room went still. Mark stared at the table. Daniela looked like she'd been slapped. James's mother paled. Clara's face drained of color. "I brought a printed sample," James added, tapping the pouch. "The highlights, really. No commentary from me. I thought you should have the opportunity to explain, since you've been explaining so much to everyone without me in the room." She whispered, "You're humiliating me." "No," James said. "I'm giving you a chance to be honest." "You planned this," she spat. "You're cruel." "I planned this," he replied, "because for years you planned me. You played the wife, Clara, but you were just auditioning, and I was just the stable scene partner while you memorized your lines." She stood up, shaky, but James wasn't done. "One last thing," he said as she reached for her coat. "Julian didn't just ghost you because he's broke. He ghosted you because I sent him the full chat history, too. He never replied. Did he? You never heard back after that weekend." She froze. "I'll let your truth speak for itself." Clara didn't respond. She clutched her bag and fled the restaurant in silence, heels echoing across the stone floor like a metronome, counting down her final performance. For several minutes, no one spoke. Then James looked at Leland. "So, dessert." Leland blinked, then chuckled. "Well played." James's mother placed a hand on his arm, tears in her eyes. I didn't know." "I know," James said. "But now you do." And with that, he took a bite of tiramisu, not as a victor, not as a villain, but as a man who had finally flipped the script. Weeks passed after the dinner, but the ripple effects of that night continued to echo in quiet, transformative ways. James didn't speak of it again. He didn't need to. Clara vanished from his orbit entirely. A phantom ex-wife whose name was now a cautionary tale whispered in networking circles and avoided at brunch tables. People who once spoke to her daily began reaching out to him, not to gossip, but to reconnect, to apologize, some to simply listen. But James wasn't seeking vindication anymore. He was rebuilding, not just his life, his identity. His days now started early, often before sunrise. Mornings were for running. The rhythm of shoes on pavement helped him process the memories that still, at times, clawed their way back. The quiet shame of ignoring early signs. The embarrassment of being so blind. The bruised masculinity of being used. Yet something had shifted. James had once seen his routines, his calendar blocks, his spreadsheets, his meal preps, as signs of stability. But now, they were his armor. His strength didn't come from spontaneity. It came from discipline, from building systems that gave him space to feel without drowning in it. His therapist noticed it first. "You're smiling more," Dr. Callum said one Thursday. "I'm breathing more," James replied. He wasn't dating yet. That would come later. But he had started attending small gatherings again. Book clubs, tech meetups, quiet coffee tastings at the edge of downtown where no one knew his past. It was there, in one of those coffee shops, that he met a woman named Naomi. Not in a rom-com way. Not in a healed man meets perfect woman way. It was quiet, honest, human. She was reading Designing for Discomfort by Brené Brown. He complimented her boots. She laughed awkwardly and said they were thrifted. They talked about how cafes are too loud for real thought, but too quiet for real emotion. She wasn't dazzling, but she was real, unfiltered and curious. And James didn't flinch when she asked, "Ever been married?" "Yes," he said. "And divorced." She paused. "Hard ending. Necessary one," he replied. That was it. No oversharing. No trauma dump. Just honesty. Later that night, he looked in the mirror, and for the first time in nearly a year, he saw someone new. Not the abandoned husband. Not the safe option. Not the architect of revenge. He saw a man standing in the aftermath, dusty, scarred but whole. The ghost of Clara still lived in his memory, but it no longer haunted him. It was more like an old chapter in a book he had stopped rereading. A chapter where the protagonist made mistakes, trusted the wrong people, but emerged with new wisdom inked into every scar. Naomi texted the next morning. "I'd like to see you again. You feel anchored." James smiled. He wasn't a mansion. He wasn't a starter home. He wasn't any kind of metaphor anymore. He was James Whitaker, and he was still here. 8 months had passed since James walked out of the life he once called a marriage. 8 months since the post-it note, the burner phone, the roadside motel with peeling walls and salt-stained windows. And somehow, the man who had left as a shadow of himself had returned. Different. Not broken. Reforged. Fall had settled over the city now. Yellow leaves drifted from the trees outside his apartment like paper reminders that even endings can be beautiful. He watched them some mornings, coffee in hand, and felt the strange ache of both loss and freedom. He didn't pretend to be happy. He wasn't happy. Not in the commercial, Instagram-worthy sense. But he was honest. Present. And that was enough. Clara had all but disappeared. After the dinner, word spread. Not through James, but organically, as truth tends to do when finally uncaged. Colleagues spoke in whispers. Old friends quietly unfollowed. And even her cousin Daniela stopped responding to Clara's messages. Julian, predictably, blocked her after receiving the compiled chat logs James had sent anonymously. Not out of moral outrage, but because men like Julian can only feed on illusions. And Clara's illusion had shattered. Mark had told James she'd been spotted once, in a cafe near their old apartment, wearing sunglasses inside, and ordering a single espresso she nursed for over an hour. She looked like a placeholder, Mark said, like a woman waiting for someone who isn't coming. James felt no joy in that. What he felt was distance, like she was a character from a book he used to read every night before sleep, but no longer recognized. She'd once been his everything, and now she was just a lesson. A name, a scar with clean edges. His mother had changed, too. The woman who once believed Clara's tears over her son's silence had begun to mend the bridge between them. She cooked again, things James remembered from childhood. She called just to ask how he was doing, not to ask why he was doing anything. She'd even asked to meet Naomi, and he had said yes, because Naomi was different. Not perfect, not dramatic, just kind. There was no mystery in her affection, no manipulation behind her laughter. When James shared his story, she didn't flinch or offer pity. She simply listened, placed her hand over his, and said, "That couldn't have been easy, but I'm glad you left." They didn't label their connection. Not yet. James didn't need titles anymore. What he needed, what he had always needed, was truth. And Naomi gave it to him in quiet conversations, gentle pauses, and the space to just be. His apartment had transformed, too. Gone with the sterile walls. He painted them warm gray. Bought a couch that he actually liked. A deep green sectional that wrapped around his reading nook. He filled the shelves with books he loved, not the ones that matched Clara's aesthetic. There were succulents he sometimes forgot to water. A wine rack he rarely used. And above the desk, he mounted an old photograph of a mountain trail he once hiked with his grandfather, a symbol of something enduring, something earned. He even began teaching a night course at a community college, not for the money, but for the joy. He spoke about architecture, about systems, about failure and flexibility. One night, a student asked, "Have you ever had to tear down something before you could build it right?" James paused and smiled. "Once," he said, "and it was the most painful and necessary blueprint I ever followed." And in that moment, he knew. The revenge hadn't been about destroying Clara. Not really. It had been about restoring himself. He had taken back the narrative, not with rage, not with cruelty, but with quiet precision, with discipline, with a soul-deep clarity that Clara had never imagined he possessed. She called him starter home, but he had become a land on which he would build something lasting. And it was his now, fully, unapologetically.